The morning in downtown Chicago was typical, cold, gray, and relentless. The city pulsed with activity as hurried pedestrians navigated crowded sidewalks, their heads bowed against the biting wind. Amid the chaos, Marcus sat alone on a worn wooden bench in the middle of Lincoln Square Park. The bench, though cracked and weathered, offered a brief reprieve from the harshness of the streets. Marcus's appearance was a stark contrast to the bustling professionals and well-dressed families who frequented the park. His threadbare jacket barely shielded him from the chill, and his sneakers, held together by duct tape, bore witness to miles of wandering. The backpack slung over his shoulder contained all he owned: a few changes of clothes, a tattered photo of his late mother, and a notebook where he occasionally scribbled poems or reflections. Marcus wasn't asking for charity, nor was he causing any trouble. He simply sat, his gaze following the movements of children playing nearby, their laughter a reminder of a life he once knew. The joy on their faces contrasted sharply with the emptiness he felt inside. For Marcus, the park was one of the few places he felt human. Here, he could watch the world move around him and imagine, just for a moment, that he was part of it. But even this fragile peace was fleeting. A patrol car rolled to a stop near the park entrance, its flashing lights cutting through the overcast sky. Officer Johnson stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel path as he scanned the area. His uniform was pristine, his badge polished to a blinding shine. Everything about Johnson exuded authority, an authority he often wielded as a weapon rather than a shield. He spotted Marcus almost instantly, his sharp eyes narrowing. Johnson had a knack for finding easy targets, and Marcus, with his worn clothes and quiet demeanor, fit the profile perfectly. "Hey!" Johnson's voice boomed across the park, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. "You, on the bench." Marcus looked up, startled but calm. He instinctively clutched the straps of his backpack, unsure of what he had done to warrant such attention. "Yes, officer?" Johnson strode toward him, his hand resting casually on his holster. "What do you think you're doing here?" "I'm just sitting, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steady but cautious. "Not bothering anyone." Johnson stopped a few feet away, his stance wide and imposing. "Sitting, huh? This park isn't for loitering. People like you make decent folks uncomfortable. Move along." Marcus blinked, his chest tightening. He glanced around the park, noting how everyone else seemed to have found sudden interest in their phones or conversations. No one intervened. No one even looked his way. "Officer," Marcus began, his voice laced with quiet resolve, "I'm not loitering. I'm not asking for money or causing trouble. I'm just sitting on a public bench." Johnson's lip curled into a sneer. "Don't get smart with me. You think you're special because you've got a few clever words? I know your type. Always looking for an excuse, always playing the victim." The words stung, though Marcus had heard them before. The weight of systemic racism and prejudice wasn't new to him, but each encounter added another layer to the wounds he carried. "I'm not playing anything," Marcus said, meeting Johnson's gaze. "I'm just exercising my right to exist in a public space." Johnson took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You've got two choices. Leave now or I make you leave." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen this before, an authority figure using power to demean and intimidate. He could comply and walk away, but that would mean accepting the indignity, accepting that his presence was somehow offensive. "I'm not breaking any law," Marcus said, his voice firm. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence broken only by the distant chatter of children and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Johnson's frustration boiled over. In one swift motion, he grabbed Marcus by the arm and yanked him to his feet. "Get up," Johnson barked, his grip tight enough to bruise. Marcus winced but refused to cry out. The pain was secondary to the humiliation of being manhandled in front of a growing audience. A few people had stopped to watch, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. But no one stepped forward. Across the street, Michael adjusted the lapels of his tailored jacket as he exited a coffee shop. He had seen the flashing lights and heard Johnson's raised voice. His eyes scanned the park, landing on the scene unfolding by the bench. Michael was a corporate lawyer, a man of sharp instincts and a deep sense of justice. Something about the interaction didn't sit right with him. He noticed Marcus's calm demeanor, contrasting starkly with Johnson's aggression. Without hesitation, Michael crossed the street, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. His tall frame and confident stride drew attention, and soon others began to take notice. "Excuse me, officer," Michael called out, his voice calm but commanding. "What seems to be the issue here?" Johnson turned sharply, his face flushing with irritation. "This doesn't concern you. Keep moving." Michael stopped a few feet away, his sharp eyes locking onto Johnson's. When a public servant appears to be abusing their authority, it concerns all of us. The crowd began to grow, whispers rippling through the onlookers. Michael's presence brought an air of legitimacy that Marcus's pleas alone hadn't. "Look," Johnson snapped, his grip on Marcus tightening. "This man is loitering. He has no business here." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Loitering? Sitting on a public bench isn't a crime. And from what I can see, he hasn't caused any disturbance." Johnson's jaw clenched, his free hand resting on his holster. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Stay out of this." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for Johnson to see. "I've been recording this entire interaction, and I'm sure Internal Affairs and the local news would love to see how you're protecting and serving today." For a moment, the park was silent. Johnson's face darkened, his authority being challenged in front of an audience. Marcus glanced at Michael, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Let him go," Michael said firmly. The tension hung thick in the air, every eye in the park now fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Johnson's grip on Marcus's arm remained firm, his knuckles white with tension. The growing crowd only fueled his frustration. To Johnson, this wasn't just a matter of maintaining control, it was about asserting dominance. His pride as an officer, his authority, was being questioned, and he wasn't going to back down without a fight. "Turn off that phone," Johnson snapped at Michael, his voice laced with anger. Michael didn't flinch. "Not a chance, officer. I'm well within my rights to record a public interaction, especially one that appears to involve the abuse of power." The tension in the air was suffocating. Marcus stood still, his arms still held tightly by Johnson, his body stiff with a mixture of pain and humiliation. He was used to being invisible, overlooked, and ignored. But now, with eyes on him, he felt the weight of his situation more acutely than ever. Johnson pulled Marcus closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "Do you think this guy's going to save you? People like him don't care about people like you. They just want to stir up trouble and feel good about themselves." Marcus didn't respond. His chest heaved as he fought to keep his composure. He could feel the sting of tears threatening to form, but he wouldn't give Johnson the satisfaction of seeing him break. Michael stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Let him go, officer. Now." Johnson's eyes darted to the crowd. He could see phones raised, their cameras trained on him. His jaw clenched as he weighed his options. He wasn't afraid of Michael or the bystanders, but he knew the power of social media, the reach of a single video. Finally, with a frustrated grunt, Johnson released Marcus's arm, shoving him backward in the process. Marcus stumbled, but managed to stay on his feet. "There. He's free," Johnson said mockingly, holding his hands up as if to say, "Are you happy now?" Michael narrowed his eyes. "This isn't over, officer. I'll make sure your actions today are brought to light." Johnson scoffed. "You think anyone cares about a vagrant and a self-righteous lawyer? Good luck with that." Turning his attention back to Marcus, Johnson jabbed a finger in his direction. "You better stay out of trouble. Next time, I won't be so lenient." Marcus felt his stomach churn. Lenient. The word hung in the air, a bitter reminder of how easily Johnson had twisted the narrative to paint himself as the victim. As Johnson walked away, his boots crunching against the gravel, the crowd began to disperse. The spectacle was over, and the city resumed its relentless pace. Michael turned to Marcus, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" Marcus nodded slowly, though the pain in his arm told a different story. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to step in, but you did. I appreciate that." Michael studied Marcus for a moment. There was something in his eyes, a depth, a quiet strength that spoke of years of endurance. I couldn't just stand by and watch that happen. It's not right. Marcus hesitated, then extended his hand. Marcus. Michael shook it firmly. Michael, and you don't have to thank me. What that officer did was wrong, plain and simple. He needs to be held accountable. Marcus shook his head. Guys like him never face consequences. They do what they want, and people like me just have to take it. Michael's jaw tightened. Not this time. I saw everything, and I have the footage to prove it. If you're willing, we can take this further. Marcus looked away, his shoulders slumping. I've been down that road before. Complaints get buried, and I end up worse off for speaking out. Michael stepped closer, his voice steady and firm. This time, you're not alone. I'm a lawyer, Marcus. I know how the system works, and I know how to fight it. But I can't do it without you. Marcus met Michael's gaze, searching for any trace of insincerity. All he saw was determination. For the first time in a long time, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. All right, Marcus said finally. Let's do it. The following days weighed heavily on Marcus. The incident with Officer Johnson replayed in his mind like a broken record, each detail etched vividly in his memory. The way Johnson's grip bruised his arm, the mocking tone in his voice, the shame of being treated like he didn't belong in a space meant for everyone. Michael had promised to help, but Marcus couldn't shake his doubts. He had seen too many systems fail people like him. Yet, the lawyer's determination had left a mark. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the faintest glimmer of hope, though he wasn't sure if it was real or just another illusion. The optimism was short-lived. 2 days after the confrontation, Marcus was sitting outside a small diner, a few blocks from the park. He had spent the morning looking for day labor opportunities, but had come up empty. His stomach growled as the smell of bacon and eggs wafted through the air. He wasn't panhandling, just resting, trying to gather the energy to keep moving. But then he saw him. Officer Johnson's patrol car pulled into view, the familiar flashing lights making Marcus's pulse quicken. Johnson stepped out, his face twisted into a smirk as soon as he spotted Marcus. Back again. Huh? Johnson's voice carried the same venom as before. Didn't I tell you to stay out of trouble? Marcus stood slowly, his body stiff with tension. I'm not doing anything wrong, officer. Just resting. Johnson stepped closer, his hand once again hovering near his holster. Resting? Funny how people like you always have excuses. We don't need your kind hanging around, making decent folks nervous. Marcus clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. I'm not bothering anyone. If you want me to leave, just say so and I will. Johnson's smirk widened. Not so fast. I think we need to check if you're carrying anything illegal. Before Marcus could protest, Johnson grabbed his arm and began patting him down roughly. The humiliation was unbearable. People on the street slowed their pace, their eyes darting toward the scene before quickly looking away. No one stepped in. Nothing, Johnson said, almost disappointed as he finished the search. He shoved Marcus backward. You're lucky this time. But don't think for a second I'll let you off so easy next time. Marcus stumbled, but caught himself. He could feel the stares of passers-by, the silent judgment in their eyes. He wasn't just a man to them. He was a problem, an inconvenience they wished would disappear. As Johnson walked away, Marcus felt the weight of the injustice pressing down on him. His resolve faltered, his shoulders slumping under the strain of it all. That evening, Marcus met with Michael in a small coffee shop. The lawyer was already seated, a laptop open in front of him, his expression focused and intense. You're late, Michael said as Marcus slid into the seat across from him. Got held up, Marcus muttered, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Michael studied him for a moment. Was it Johnson again? Marcus nodded, avoiding Michael's gaze. He's not going to let this go. Guys like him never do. Michael leaned forward, his voice low but firm. That's why we can't back down. I've been reviewing the footage and putting together a case. But I need more than just that one encounter. Has he harassed you before? Marcus hesitated. Yeah, a few times. Not like the other day, but he's always around. Always watching. Michael nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Good. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case. Strong case? Marcus let out a bitter laugh. Do you really think anyone's going to care about this? About me? People see a homeless black man and assume I'm guilty of something. They don't care what happens to me. Michael's expression softened. I care, Marcus. And I'm not the only one. Johnson's behavior isn't just wrong. It's illegal. If we can prove a pattern of harassment, we can hold him accountable. But I need you to trust me, Marcus sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. He wanted to believe Michael, wanted to believe that justice was possible. But years of systemic failure had left him jaded. I'll try, Marcus said finally. But don't expect too much. The next day, Marcus's fears were realized. He was walking near the edge of the park when a patrol car sped toward him, lights flashing. Marcus froze, his heart sinking as Johnson stepped out, flanked by another officer. Hands where I can see them, Johnson barked, his tone harsher than ever. Marcus complied, raising his hands slowly. What's going on? We got a report of a theft in the area, Johnson said, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. You matched the description. Marcus's stomach churned. I didn't steal anything. Sure you didn't, Johnson sneered. He gestured to the other officer, who began rifling through Marcus's backpack without consent. The humiliation was unbearable. A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs carrying a mix of curiosity and judgment. After several agonizing minutes, the officers found nothing incriminating. Looks like you're off the hook, for now, Johnson said, shoving Marcus's backpack toward him. But don't think this means you're innocent. I'll be watching you. As the officers drove away, Marcus stood frozen, his body trembling with anger and despair. He glanced at the crowd, hoping for a shred of compassion, but their eyes were cold, their expressions indifferent. He walked away, his head low, his heart heavy. For Marcus, it felt like the walls were closing in, and there was no escape. The cold night air clung to Marcus as he sat beneath a flickering street lamp, his back pressed against the rough brick wall of an abandoned building. The day's events weighed heavily on him, suffocating like the relentless smog of the city. He stared at his hands, the bruises from Johnson's grip still visible, a painful reminder of the injustice he endured daily. Marcus wasn't always this way. Homeless, struggling, invisible. He once had a job, a modest apartment, and a life filled with dreams. But a cascade of misfortunes had stripped him of everything. First, the factory where he worked shut down, leaving him without a source of income. Then, unable to pay his rent, he was evicted. His attempts to find new work were met with closed doors and veiled prejudice. Employers saw his dark skin, his unkempt appearance, and turned him away without a second thought. As the nights grew colder and his resources dwindled, Marcus learned to navigate a world that saw him as a burden rather than a human being. Yet, despite everything, he clung to a sense of dignity, refusing to succumb entirely to despair. But Johnson was chipping away at that resolve. Meanwhile, Officer Johnson sat in a dimly lit bar, a glass of whiskey in hand. He leaned back in his chair, the flickering neon sign outside casting an eerie glow on his face. To those who knew him, Johnson was the quintessential cop, dedicated, tough, and unyielding. But beneath that exterior lay a man consumed by bitterness and insecurity. Johnson grew up in a working-class neighborhood, where his father drilled into him the idea that life was a battlefield, and respect was earned through dominance. His badge became a shield, not just against criminals, but against his own insecurities. In his eyes, maintaining control wasn't just part of the job. It was his identity. To Johnson, people like Marcus were a reminder of everything he hated: vulnerability, helplessness, and the systemic inequities he refused to acknowledge. It was easier to see Marcus as a problem to be managed than a person to be understood. As he sipped his whiskey, his mind drifted to the confrontation in the park. The lawyer, Michael, had been a thorn in his side, but what bothered him most was Marcus's calm defiance. It wasn't anger or resistance that Johnson saw, it was dignity. And that, more than anything, enraged him. "No one defies me," Johnson muttered under his breath, his grip tightening around the glass. The next morning, Marcus met Michael at the small legal aid office where Michael worked pro bono cases in his spare time. The office was modest, with walls lined with shelves overflowing with legal books and case files. Michael motioned for Marcus to sit. "I've been working on your case," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "We're building a strong argument, but we need to establish a pattern of misconduct. That means we need witnesses or additional complaints against Johnson." Marcus hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of the folder. "Who's going to speak up? People see what happens, but no one wants to get involved. They're too scared or don't care." Michael nodded. "I get it, but we don't need everyone, just one or two people willing to step forward. And I've already reached out to some folks who might help." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy." Michael smiled faintly. "When I commit to something, I give it everything I've got. And I believe in this. I believe in you." The words caught Marcus off guard. He had grown so accustomed to being dismissed and overlooked that Michael's unwavering support felt almost foreign. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked softly. Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Because I've seen what happens when people like Johnson get away with this kind of behavior. It's not just about you, Marcus. It's about everyone he's hurt and everyone he'll hurt if no one stops him." Marcus nodded slowly, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. "All right, let's do this." Later that week, Marcus found himself back in Lincoln Square Park, this time accompanied by Michael and a small group of volunteers from the legal aid office. They were there to speak with locals, hoping to gather accounts of Johnson's behavior. It didn't take long for the stories to emerge. "That guy?" said an older man sitting on a nearby bench. "Yeah, I've seen him hassle folks before. Always going after the ones who can't fight back." A young mother added, "He pulled my brother over last month for no reason. Kept him on the side of the road for an hour, searching his car. Found nothing but still gave him a ticket." As the testimonies piled up, Michael's confidence grew. "This is exactly what we need," he told Marcus. "It's not just you. Johnson's been abusing his power for years, and now we have proof." But just as things seemed to be turning in their favor, Johnson appeared. He strode into the park, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Marcus and the group. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Michael stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "We're gathering evidence, officer. Evidence of your pattern of misconduct." Johnson's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You think you're clever, don't you? Stirring up trouble where there isn't any." "There's plenty of trouble," Michael shot back. "And you've been the cause of it." The crowd grew quiet, the tension thick as Johnson and Michael locked eyes. Marcus stood slightly behind Michael, his heart pounding. For the first time, he wasn't facing Johnson alone. Johnson smirked, but it was forced. "We'll see about that," he said before turning on his heel and walking away, his shoulders stiff with barely concealed rage. That night, Marcus sat alone in the shelter where he sometimes found a bed. The events of the day played over in his mind, a mixture of fear and hope swirling in his chest. For so long, he had felt powerless against the injustices of the world. But now, with Michael's help, he was beginning to see the possibility of change. Yet, deep down, he knew this fight was far from over. Johnson wasn't the kind of man to back down easily. The following week brought a surge of optimism. Michael worked tirelessly, compiling a robust case file against Johnson. With first-hand accounts from local witnesses, video evidence from the initial encounter, and records of prior complaints filed against the officer, it seemed they finally had enough to expose him. Marcus began to feel the weight on his shoulders lift, a tentative hope replacing the constant dread he had carried for years. On a brisk Monday morning, Marcus and Michael sat in the office of the local precinct's Internal Affairs Division. The sterile white walls and the hum of a nearby copier did little to ease Marcus's nerves. The two officers conducting the interview appeared attentive and professional, nodding as Michael presented the evidence. "This is substantial," said Detective Monroe, a middle-aged woman with piercing gray eyes. She flipped through the thick file Michael had assembled. "If even half of this is corroborated, Officer Johnson could be facing serious disciplinary action." Marcus exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening slightly for the first time in weeks. "You think this will actually lead to something?" he asked. Monroe looked at him, her expression serious but kind. "It's not just about what we think, it's about what we can prove. But yes, this is enough to start a formal investigation." Michael nodded, his confidence evident. "We're not just doing this for Marcus. We're doing this to prevent others from experiencing the same abuse." Monroe stood, extending her hand. "We'll keep you updated as the investigation progresses. Thank you for coming forward." As they left the precinct, Marcus turned to Michael. "Do you really think they'll follow through?" Michael smiled. "They have to. With this much evidence, there's no way they can ignore it." For the next few days, Marcus felt lighter, even daring to smile at the strangers who passed him on the street. He began to think that perhaps justice was within reach, that his story might not end in despair. But then, the retaliation began. One evening, as Marcus made his way to a shelter, he noticed a patrol car idling at the corner. The silhouette inside was unmistakable. Johnson. Marcus's pulse quickened, and he quickened his pace. The car crept forward, its headlights casting an eerie glow on the sidewalk ahead of him. Finally, Johnson pulled up alongside him and rolled down the window. "Thought you were smart, huh?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "I don't want any trouble," Marcus said, his voice steady but strained. Johnson chuckled, a cold sound that sent shivers down Marcus's spine. "You've already got trouble, boy. You think internal affairs is going to save you? They're just going to sweep this under the rug, like they always do. And when they're done, I'll still be here, watching." Marcus said nothing, his heart pounding as he continued walking. "Better watch yourself," Johnson called after him, his voice echoing in the quiet street. The next day, Marcus found his usual bench in the park occupied, not by strangers or other homeless individuals, but by two uniformed officers. As he approached, they stood, blocking his path. "You're not welcome here," one of them said, his tone sharp. "I'm just trying to sit," Marcus replied, his frustration mounting. "It's a public park. Not for you." "It's not," the officer said, stepping closer. Marcus turned and walked away, his hands trembling. It was clear that Johnson wasn't acting alone anymore. His colleagues were complicit in the harassment. When Marcus met with Michael that evening, he recounted the events with a mixture of anger and despair. "They're coming after me," Marcus said, pacing the small office. "It's not just Johnson anymore. He's got others involved." Michael leaned forward, his expression grave. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. People like Johnson thrive on fear and intimidation. But we can't let him scare us into silence." Marcus stopped pacing, his gaze fixed on Michael. "What if this backfires? What if they come after you next?" Michael shook his head. "Let them try. I've dealt with bullies in suits, in courtrooms, and on the streets. Johnson is no different." A week later, Marcus's worst fears came true. Michael received a letter from Internal Affairs stating that the investigation was being delayed due to insufficient corroboration. The witnesses who had initially spoken out against Johnson had retracted their statements, citing fears for their safety. Marcus stared at the letter, his hands shaking. "They got to them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael slammed the letter onto his desk, his jaw clenched. "This isn't over," he said, his voice firm. "They think they can scare people into silence, but they're wrong. We're not stopping." But Marcus wasn't so sure. The hope that had blossomed in his chest was withering, replaced by the familiar weight of despair. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over Lincoln Square Park. Marcus sat on the same bench where it all began, his hands resting on his lap, his gaze distant. Days had passed since the Internal Affairs investigation stalled, and the weight of disappointment pressed heavily on him. But today was different. Something inside him felt resolute. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his life anymore. As Marcus sat in quiet reflection, the familiar screech of tires snapped him out of his thoughts. A patrol car sped into the park, its tires kicking up gravel. Officer Johnson emerged, slamming the car door with enough force to make heads turn. His uniform was as crisp as ever, his face a mask of barely concealed rage. Johnson stalked toward Marcus, his boots pounding against the pavement. The air in the park grew tense, the scattered onlookers freezing in place as they sensed the confrontation brewing. Well, Johnson sneered, stopping a few feet away. Look who decided to come back. Didn't I tell you this park isn't for people like you? Marcus looked up, his expression calm but resolute. It's a public park. I have every right to be here. Johnson's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. You've got a lot of nerve, boy. After everything, you still think you can get away with challenging me? Marcus stood slowly, his heart pounding but his voice steady. I'm not challenging you. I'm standing up for myself. You've had your way for too long. Johnson's hand moved to his belt, his fingers brushing the handle of his baton. The silent threat hung in the air. I warned you, didn't I? You think you're some kind of hero now? Think you've got people on your side? Let me show you what happens to troublemakers like you. He grabbed Marcus's arm with a bruising grip, yanking him forward. The crowd, initially hesitant, began to gather, their murmurs growing louder. What are you doing? Marcus demanded, struggling against Johnson's hold. You're under arrest for resisting an officer, Johnson spat, his voice loud enough to carry over the murmurs of the onlookers. For what? Marcus exclaimed, his voice rising. I haven't done anything wrong. Johnson twisted Marcus's arm behind his back, his movements rough and unnecessary. I don't need a reason. You're a menace, and I'm making sure you don't cause any more problems. Across the street, Michael was finishing a phone call when he noticed the commotion. His eyes locked on the scene in the park, and his blood ran cold. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the growing crowd, his phone already in his hand. Stop! Michael's voice rang out, cutting through the noise. Let him go. Johnson turned, his face twisting into a scowl as Michael approached, his phone pointed directly at the officer. You again, Johnson growled. Haven't you caused enough trouble? Michael's voice was steady, loud enough for the crowd to hear. This is an illegal arrest. You're abusing your power, and I've got it all on camera. The tension in the air was electric. The crowd, emboldened by Michael's presence, began pulling out their phones, recording the confrontation from every angle. Johnson's colleagues arrived moments later, their faces uncertain as they saw the scene unfolding. You better back off, lawyer, Johnson hissed. This isn't your business. Michael stepped closer, his expression unwavering. When a public servant abuses their authority, it becomes everyone's business. Release him now. Johnson's grip tightened on Marcus, his face reddening with fury. You think you're a hero? All you're doing is stirring up trouble. Michael raised his voice, addressing the crowd. What you're seeing here is the systematic harassment of a man who has done nothing wrong. Officer Johnson has a history of targeting vulnerable individuals, and we will not let this go unnoticed. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their voices rising in support. Let him go, someone shouted. Yeah, we're all watching, another added. Johnson's jaw clenched as he realized the situation was spiraling out of his control. His colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence in their leader faltering under the weight of the public scrutiny. You think this is over? Johnson snarled, shoving Marcus forward. You're all the same. Nothing but trouble. Marcus stumbled but was caught by Michael, who steadied him. You okay? Michael asked, his voice low. Marcus nodded, his body trembling with adrenaline. Yeah, thanks. Michael turned to the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of authority. This is exactly why we need to stand together. People like Officer Johnson count on our silence, but today, we've shown that we won't back down. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices echoing through the park. Johnson stormed back to his patrol car, his face a mask of fury as he drove away, the shouts of the crowd following him. That night, Michael uploaded the video to social media, accompanied by a detailed account of the day's events. Within hours, the footage went viral, igniting a firestorm of outrage. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #AccountabilityNow began trending, and the video was picked up by local and national news outlets. By morning, the story had reached City Hall. Community leaders, activists, and even local politicians called for an independent investigation into Johnson's conduct. Protests were organized outside the police precinct, demanding accountability and systemic reform. Marcus, initially hesitant, agreed to speak at a press conference organized by Michael and several local activists. Standing before a sea of cameras and microphones, Marcus took a deep breath and began. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about everyone who has been silenced, everyone who has been treated as less than human. No one should have to live in fear of the people who are supposed to protect us. It's time for change." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices united in solidarity. For the first time in years, Marcus felt seen, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person with dignity and worth. The public uproar following the viral video reached a fever pitch. Social media platforms flooded with comments, shares, and calls for action. Protesters outside the police precinct held signs reading, "Justice for Marcus," and "End police abuse." The cries for accountability echoed throughout the city, drawing the attention of major news outlets and local politicians. For Marcus, the days following the confrontation were surreal. Strangers approached him on the street, offering words of encouragement, meals, and even job opportunities. Though the kindness felt overwhelming at times, Marcus understood that his story had touched a nerve, becoming a symbol for those who had been silenced for far too long. Michael worked tirelessly, using the momentum of public outrage to push for immediate action. The Oversight Committee accelerated their investigation, bolstered by mounting pressure from activists and the media. The evidence against Johnson was overwhelming. Years of harassment complaints, reports of excessive force, and testimonies from victims who now felt emboldened to speak out. 3 weeks later, the Oversight Committee delivered their findings. The report was damning. Johnson's record revealed a pattern of abuse that had been ignored or covered up by the department for years. The report also implicated senior officials who had turned a blind eye to his actions, allowing him to operate with impunity. The announcement came during a televised press conference. The chief of police stood behind a podium, his expression grim. Effective immediately, Officer Johnson is suspended without pay, pending criminal charges. "We recognize the pain and anger this case has caused in our community, and we are committed to implementing reforms to ensure accountability within our ranks." For Marcus, hearing those words felt surreal. He watched the press conference from Michael's office, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "Does this mean it's over?" he asked, his voice quiet. Michael shook his head. "It's a step in the right direction, but it's not over. Johnson may be off the streets, but we need to make sure this doesn't happen again. To you or anyone else." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'm ready to keep fighting." The consequences for Johnson didn't stop at his suspension. As more victims came forward, the case against him grew stronger. Lawsuits began piling up, not just against Johnson but also against the department for failing to address his behavior. The city faced public scrutiny, and pressure mounted to enact real reforms. Protests outside the precinct swelled in size, with activists demanding systemic change. The chants of "no justice, no peace" reverberated through the streets, uniting people from all walks of life. Marcus, once invisible, was now a central figure in the movement. A month later, Marcus stood on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by reporters, activists, and community members. Michael stood beside him, along with several victims who had come forward during the investigation. Cameras flashed as Marcus stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. "This fight isn't just about one bad cop," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about a system that allowed him to abuse his power for years. It's about the people who were ignored, dismissed, and silenced. We're here today to say enough is enough. No one should have to live in fear of the people who are supposed to protect them." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the plaza. Marcus continued, his confidence growing with each word. "I'm standing here because of people who refuse to look away. People like Michael, who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. This isn't just my victory, it's ours. And the fight doesn't end here." As Marcus stepped back, Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did good," Michael said, his voice low. "Real good." Over the following months, significant changes began to take shape. The police department implemented new accountability measures, including body cameras, mandatory de-escalation training, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board. Johnson was formally charged with multiple counts of misconduct, and a civil lawsuit filed by Marcus and other victims ensured he would never wear a badge again. The reforms were a victory, but for Marcus, the real triumph was personal. With the help of local organizations and a flood of donations from supporters, he found stable housing and began volunteering with advocacy groups focused on ending systemic injustice. His story became a symbol of resilience, and his voice became a beacon of hope for others who had faced similar struggles. On a crisp autumn evening, Marcus attended a community event held in the same park where his ordeal began. Families gathered on picnic blankets, children played on the swings, and the smell of food trucks filled the air. Marcus stood near the stage, waiting for his turn to speak. When his name was called, the crowd erupted into cheers. Marcus stepped up to the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. He took a deep breath, his heart full of gratitude and determination. Not long ago, I sat on a bench right here in this park, feeling invisible, feeling like my voice didn't matter. But today, I stand here because of all of you, because we came together and said, "No more." The crowd listened intently as Marcus continued. This fight isn't over. There are still people out there facing the same struggles I did. But we've shown that when we stand together, we can make change happen. We can be the voices for those who can't speak. And we can build a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. As Marcus stepped back, the crowd rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. Tears welled in his eyes as he realized how far he had come, from being silenced and humiliated to becoming a symbol of hope and strength.